Good. So, should we get started?
Yeah, I think why not? I think it's a good time to start.
All right. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our new online talk series. A first for both of us. Reflections, Foundations and Developments of Generative Grammar. Now, syntactic theory in the generative framework has been developing for the past 75 years, from the beginnings of what was soon to be called standard theory, the extended standard theory, by government and binding, and the principles and parameters theory, all the way to the minimalist program. And of course, even minimalism has experienced several defining stages in its 30-year history. Now, add to that some non-mainstream generative approaches, alternative frameworks, computational modeling, and so much more. We are now, after 3/4 of a century, at a point that it might be time to write the history of our field on its foundations as they bear on current work, and to discuss outstanding questions, which may reveal avenues for future research as well. Or so is our hope. So, to facilitate this, we are introducing an online talk series where long-standing scholars who continue to contribute to the development of syntactic theory will reflect on their early current perspective, tracing the development of the theory over time. Enter Reflections. Let's start with some housekeeping before Lydia will introduce herself, present today's speaker, and say a few more words. The same Lydia, by the way, who emailed me out of the blue about half a year ago, writing about what she will tell you herself in a moment. I'm not sure what she wanted from me, so I said, nah, this sounds like a great idea, and go ahead, group together with a bunch of young guns to get this going. She said they're all too busy trying to make a career for themselves, which of course is becoming increasingly difficult. So I suggested that she could maybe get more experienced peers to run this online series with. Apparently, she had also talked to all of them already as well, and nobody wanted to do it. By that time, several emails into our exchange, I felt pressed against the wall, and the only return I could think of was, great, let's do it. So here we are, Lydia and me, Cleanthus Groman, with our new Reflections series. So back to housekeeping rules. First, please keep yourselves muted throughout, but turn your cameras on as much as possible. It's always nice for the presenter to see a wide-eyed audience rather than just names on a tile. And please avoid extensive discussions in the chat, as this would only distract the presenters and everyone else. Second, let me also give a quick nod to the glowing lectures organized by, well, Glow. So if anybody is here, like Susie, if anyone from the glowing lectures organizing committee is here, please post the link in the chat. Feel free to advertise the glowing lectures. And of course, as anyone who attended the first glowing lecture will notice, we shamelessly adopted some of their styles, rules, and other learnings. Third, one of these learnings has to do with the Q&A after the talk. We would like to give the floor to students and junior colleagues before opening the discussion up to everyone else. I thought that was a great idea, and Lydia will fill in the details. And finally, we have a little bit of a schedule planned. Details can be found online on the Reflections homepage, or the Facebook group, or even our YouTube channel. If you register, you'll also receive irregular updates from us. Suffice it to say, at this point, Richie Kane will be the next presenter at Reflections on February 10th of next year. So please save the date. And with that, I'll hand over to Lydia.
All right. Thank you, Clay. Hi, everyone. And I get the best part. It's my pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker, Robert May, who really doesn't need any introduction because he's such a legendary figure in our field. But we have a large and diverse audience here with diverse backgrounds. So I will take a few moments and say a few words about Robert. He is a distinguished university professor emeritus of philosophy and linguistics from UC Davis. He got his PhD from MIT in '77. So he was right in the thick of those huge developmental changes and stages of generative grammar. And he made some fundamental contributions to work on Anaphora, and the nature of logical form. And for several decades now, he's been an incredibly productive researcher in not just one field, but two, linguistics and philosophy. And he's been combining those fields in a very creative way, trying to understand and expand our understanding of how logic and meaning are represented in human language. In addition to all this work, Robert is also, I have to read this one, it's a long title. He's an affiliated faculty at Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. Now, what this means, I think, is that he not only cares about his own research agenda, but I think he cares deeply about the well-being of higher education more generally, which is very admirable. And last but not least, Robert has an exceptional service record in both fields that he's in and also at the University of California. He served there, for example, as the chair of the Academic Senate, which is, a lot of work. You have to have all your colleagues respecting you and be willing to be led by you. So that's quite amazing. And he got a very prestigious Charles Nash Prize for distinguished service. So you can tell, he can do it all. Now, there is one thing that Robert is really good at, but Clay and I could not incorporate it into this event because of Zoom format. And you know what it is? It's his ability to walk during his presentations. He has this amazing walk when he presents, and if you had a pleasure of attending his talks in person, you would notice that he not only does just a few steps here and there, I think he reaches his daily step goal somewhere halfway through the talk. But as fascinating as it is to watch, we're on Zoom, so you'll have to use your imagination for that one, okay? And on this amusing note, let's welcome Robert May. Robert?
Well, thanks very much. Let me share my screen. There we go. Share. Okay, let me just get a few of you. First, whatever. Oh, I see. First of all, let me thank Lydia and Clay for organizing this. This idea for this began back at a really wonderful event in honor of Howard Lasnik, who is on last spring, and a discussion, I guess, that emerged among a number of people, younger people in the field, who came clear were very interested in the origins of the field, and in particular, sort of its development, given, as Clay mentioned, that this has been an ongoing enterprise well on to the 7th decade. And since, a goodly number of us were around, said, well, you guys should organize a lecture series, an online lecture series, to kind of create, as Clay said, a kind of oral history of the field by those who were part of its development. They've set up a great series. I see Richie on and Howard, who will be giving talks in the future. And I'm very honored to be the first one, but I only think that's because I was the one who shot off my mouth about the idea, and so I got roped into doing it relative. Oh, and I see Bob Frieden's here too, and he'll also be giving a talk as well. So thanks very much, and let's start the talk. So since this is the first talk, and since I think, as I've just mentioned, it's part of this is to really think about a research project, as Clay mentioned, has had lots of twists and turns, but a coherent research project of 7 decades. That's pretty remarkable. And I think particularly it's a good time to sort of go back and try to go back to the moment at which sort of was the punctuating moment which started this. I mean, something as rich as generative grammar has been as a research enterprise, there had to be an intense defining moment, what, as we'll see, is properly called, I think, a scientific revolution. So I'd like to go back there and start there, okay? And start you with a kind of very broad stroke setup of the intellectual milieu that was present in the middle of the 20th century, in particular, philosophy in the mid-1950s, very much under the influence at this point of the ideas of Carnap and Quine and others. And they were really concerned with issues about science and the nature of science. And there were three, I think, broadly speaking, three main questions which people were concerned with, and had really come to the fore by the mid-1950s, highly articulated by that point. The first was the nature of the systemization of scientific inquiry, how to ensure the appropriate levels of reasoning would be enforced in scientific inquiry. And this led to deep discussions about logic and language and the relation of language to logical inquiries. The second part was discussions of scientific knowledge, and in particular, scientific knowledge in the empiricist tradition. This is obviously very much under the influence of the discussions between Carnap and Quine, the notion of analyticity, the notions of meaning, and of course, the punctuating essay, of course, is Quine's Two Dogmas. And finally, the third is issues having to do with properties of scientific change, how we could go from one kind of scientific paradigm, a theory, particular dominant theory, to another. And in that last, the most popular notion, and one which is entered into the sort of general scientific intellectual lore, is the notion of scientific revolution, dating back to Kuhn's epical book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And a scientific revolution, is going to be marked by some kind of deep conceptual advance, something that really deepens our understanding of the lawful properties of whatever domain is being discussed. And with that came the questions of not only conceptual advance, but commensurability, because if it's an advance, we have to be able to have it in relation to something. It has to be advancing over something. And how do we ensure that they somehow are still talking about the same thing between the old theory and the new theory, if the new theory is bringing in new concepts? So it's in this very intense philosophical discussion. It's really dominating, certainly in the United States, and particularly in the northeastern part of the United States, is very much dominating discussion, intellectual discussion. And into the middle of that gets dropped sort of the document of our profession of generative grammar, Noam Chomsky's The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory in 1955. It's a book that was supposed to be, I gather, his dissertation. For reasons it didn't actually become that. Only part of it actually was his PhD dissertation. And it was circulated in various mimeograph and microfilmed and various other forms. Finally, it was one of a sort of set of versions that it went through. It was published in 1973 with really an exceptionally, really great introduction that Chomsky wrote at the time. That's a funny story that that was presented as a class when I was a graduate student, the introduction. And throughout at least it was then referred to, Noam did it a number of years, the class was referred to as How I Invented Transformational Grammar. So it's a wonderful piece. It's actually my favorite piece. Now, I think that the thesis, of course, the generative grammar was a scientific revolution. It was a conceptual advance over prior theories. And the greater depth of these concepts did give us a deeper understanding of linguistic laws. And also it increased the empirical purview in that it allowed us to really understand and focus on theoretically significant parts of natural language. As opposed to just trying to give a description of a language, it allowed us to focus on those parts of language which were theoretically interesting and helped us understand the lawful properties of language. Now, why can we say with confidence it was a scientific revolution? Well, I think the proof's in the pudding. It's the unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented growth in our understanding of human language in the last 70 years. It is just one of the most extraordinary accomplishments of intellectual activity. Obviously, I mean, I think everyone on this call understands we've barely scraped the surface, but the depth of understanding is unprecedented relative to what it was 70 years ago. And along with that, the continued vitality of generative grammar as a broad research program. So what I'd like to do in this talk, because there's so much to sort of talk about here, is just focus on two things. One is to give an overview of the conceptual advances of LSLT. Why was it, and why did it, be the focal point of a scientific revolution? What were some of the ideas, and why could we understand it? Why was there a commensurability problem? And talk a little bit about that. And secondly, I want to talk about, since it is, I guess, supposed to be somewhat personal, these talks about issues in syntax and semantic interface and the emergence of logical form, and some of my contributions to that in the mid-1970s. So let's turn to LSLT. And let's start with what I think we would all agree would be the central goal of linguistic theory, which is to define the notion of language, to give a definition. And that definition is to answer a question. And the question is, what is a language? Or more precisely, of course, in our concerns, what is a human language? And here's the answer Chomsky gives to how to go about giving that definition. It's going to be accomplished by a nexus of sub-definitions. So he says, the general theory will ultimately assume the form of a system of definitions in which phoneme, word, sentence, etc. are defined and their general properties and interrelations specified. Okay? As this idea of sort of giving this definition moved on through the years, Chomsky increasingly, leading up to about 1965, articulated sort of the philosophical underpinnings here, in the sense that no answer to the question, what is a human language, can be deemed fully adequate outside its role in explaining what it is to know a language, descriptive adequacy, and come to have that knowledge, explanatory adequacy, as he explained these notions in the first chapter of Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. And of course, the answer to these questions, and why Chomsky is partly why such a seminal thinker, conceptual thinker, is his wholehearted rejection of empiricism as ways to approach these questions of knowledge, and to introduce a more rationalist perspective into the program. And these are based on the poverty of the stimulus arguments as a powerful form of argumentation, and I'll return to that later in this whole talk. Now, its definition is going to be affected by construction of a system of linguistic levels. So he says, instead of giving a direct definition of these further notions, we can continue to construct systems of representation for sentence tokens, calling these systems linguistic levels. A sentence token can be represented as a sequence of phonemes, can also be represented as a sequence of morphemes, words, and phrases. Thus, each sentence token will have associated with a whole set of representations, each representation being a spelling in terms of elements at one linguistic level. Now, here's the commensurability issue. Where does the theory, how does this notion of level differ? Because the notion, what I've said so far, are structural linguistics, and when I use the term structural linguistics, I'll use it in the sense that Chomsky was reacting to, that is the work of Zellick Harris and related scholars, that the notion of level itself would not be anything they would find foreign. There was nothing objectionable structural linguistics would have found in the remark I just said. So the question is, where is the departure? Where does the theory of LSLT fracture from its immediate forebearers? And it fractures in how the levels are going to be constructed. So very roughly, and this is sort of the general methodology here in structural linguistics, you start from some given base, and then each higher level n is constructed from the immediately prior level n-1, so that the lower level elements are the content of the immediately highest level. So, for example, morphemes are made up of phonemes, for example. And in principle, the same procedures are applied to construction of each level. And these are going to be taxonomic procedures of classification to derive a system of categories at each successive level. One of the interesting properties, and this was seized upon in the philosophical literature, one of the interesting properties is that the procedures do not guarantee a unique solution for level n+1 given level n, and this gave rise to instrumentalistic interpretations of linguistic theory, that different grammars would be there for different purposes to describe different kinds of domains and so on. And this, of course, meshed very well with Carnap's view of the principle of tolerance and his development of empiricist thought. And how Chomsky, however, reconceptualizes how the levels are related, that really is, I think, the major breakthrough of LSLT. Here's what he says. We need not require that an element on one level have actual content on lower levels. For example, a morpheme need not have any specific sequence of phonemes or set of such sequence as its phonemic content, although given a sequence of morphemes that represent an utterance, the grammar must enable us to construct the corresponding sequence of phonemes. Since higher levels are not literally constructed out of lower ones, in this view, we are quite free to construct a high degree of interdependence. Where each of now, I'll get back to each level is formally defined as a class of derivations. I think there's two things to note here, is that each level is constructed independently so that the notions characterized at a different level are taken effectively as primitive at another level. So the notion of word at the level of say, the phrase or of syntax in general, the notion of word is going to be a primitive notion. We need not give any further analysis of the notion of words as we are concerned, say, with syntactic structure. We take that as primitive, but other levels are going to have to give that characterization in the overall characterization. The other idea that Chomsky brought in at this point is the idea of the structure of the completed solution. So one of the arguments and attacks on structural linguistics is that it never, because of this constructive process, it never got very much higher than the lowest levels, and it certainly now got to higher levels. Where what Chomsky says, look, you just give all the levels independently, and you take a completed solution, and you then look at its empirical character, what its consequences are, given you assume the completed solution. So it started from a very different perspective, but what remains the constant thread is this notion of analysis by levels. So linguistic theory characterizes classes of representations, and the representations are the markers by which each level is constituted. So here again is what Chomsky says. In carrying out linguistic analysis, then, we must construct on each level L a set of elements, which we call L markers, one of which is assigned to each grammatical utterance. The L marker of a given utterance T must contain within it all information as to the structure of T on level L. The construction of L markers for each level L is thus the fundamental task of linguistic analysis. Then the abstract characterization of linguistic theory must determine what sort of elements appear as markers in each level. So the L marker is the representational notion in linguistic theory, and they're going to contain the information about an utterance generated at level L. So roughly speaking, we can sort of roughly formalize what the theory will look like. It will look like this. A level L is a pair PR, where P sub L is the set of primes of L, and R sub L is the set of rules defined over PL. A language L is defined then as a set of levels, that is a set of linguistic levels, and a sentence of L is defined as L1 through Ln, where each Li is an L marker at level Li, where there's a unique Li for each level. So for each level L, the rules via their applications generate derivations on the basis of the primes. And the L markers are the representations of these derivations. And an L marker represents a sequential ordering of rule applications that constitute a particular derivation from a subset of the primes. So let's take an example. Take the level P of phrases. The primes are going to be morpheme sequences or words, and the symbols S, N, V, A, P, N, P, V, P, A, P, 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 etc. I'm going to stick to the notation of the day and the category notions of the day. I think you can translate them however you like into contemporary notions. They're going to be rewriting rules in Chomsky normal form defined over the primes. And then a derivation at level P is a sequence of applications of these rules, which is represented by a P marker. So here we have a P marker. Is represented a derivation by the rules. S rewrite as NP VP, VP rewrite as VNP, NP rewrite as determined noun, etc. And so the P marker is an ordered set of strings, each derived from the immediately prior in the stack by rewriting. So we sort of stack them up like that. Now, there are any number of other derivations by the same set of rules which may terminate in the same string. It's a well-known fact. I've given two. They differ in steps from line 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5, but they all give the same terminal string. Now, these derivations are represented are distinct, but they're not significantly distinct. So here's what Chomsky says about that. These distinct derivations differ only in the order in which the constituents are developed, thus inessentially from the viewpoint of constituent interpretation. And then so we can represent the equivalence class to these to which these derivations belong, and that's standardly represented by a tree structure or equivalent notations of labeled bracketing, such as there. So what we have here is just a representation of an equivalence class of derivations. Okay, that's what is represented by the tree. So a tree, a tree qua P marker is a representation of an equivalence class of derivations at level P, a history of applications of rules at that level. It must contain all information as to the structure of T at non-level T, so hence all information pertaining to categories of phrases, that is everything that is characteristic of the categorical properties of sentences, must be recoverable from the representation. And it's important to note that the tree is fully and completely interpreted. It says it's representational with respect to its informational content. It exactly represents what it's supposed to be. It is fully informational. And there's no sense in which the tree is in need of any further interpretation. And I'll come back to that point because that ties into issues when we get to issues about logical form. Now, the final part of what Chomsky put forward that I think is extremely important comes before in this comment. The obvious means for selecting among grammars is in terms of the degree of significant generalization that they achieve. In the conventional sense of the term, a generalization is a single rule about many elements. Generalizing this notion, we might measure the degree of generalization attained by a grammar in terms of the formal similarity among its generative rules, the extent to which they say similar things about elements of various sorts. Grammars with a greater degree of similarity among rules become literally shorter than others which express the same mapping. This system of representation defines a notational transformation that assigns to each grammar a number, its length when rules are amalgamated. The system for amalgamating rules expresses hypothesis as to the relations among rules that constitute linguistically significant generalizations. In this remark, Chomsky is very much channeling work of Nelson Goodman, which he's very much influenced by. And particularly with, for example, this is taken from a paper called The Unsimplicity of Ideas from 1943. The more the set of primitives can be reduced without becoming inadequate, the more comprehensively will the system exhibit the network of interrelationships that comprise its subject matter. Now, the important idea here is that we can take formal systems and we can evaluate them in a way from better to worse along some parameter in virtue of their formal properties. We don't have to ask about anything other than looking at the formal aspects of the rule system itself, okay? It's not in terms of its expressibility and not in terms of what things mean relative to what's being formally the formal system itself. So they're internal evaluative methods. To take an example of what Chomsky is expressing here, take this following grammar 1, which has the rules VP relies as V, VP, VNP, and so on, and grammar 2, which introduces the standard parentheses notation. So grammar 1 has the value of 12. You just count up all the symbols in the rules. Where grammar 2 has a value 4, so hence the linguist and a child will converge on the most highly valued grammar, the one which is value 4, that which expresses the greatest depth of generalization given available data. And this, of course, is what sort of evolved in the first chapter of Aspects of Theory of Syntax into the evaluation metric, that somehow you could look at the internal nature of the formal structure of grammars and give them in an ordered sequence such that the most highly valued would be the one on which acquisition would converge. Now, against that background, historically, this was still stuff we read when I was a graduate student, was some very important things. And the question I want to talk about relative to my work is whence semantics? Where does semantics come all this? I didn't say anything about semantics at all. In its whole construction, nothing came up about semantics or meaning. Well, one of the reasons it didn't is because of the rejection of what would come to be called the appeal to meaning. And what was the point with this is that the taxonomic procedures of level construction and structural linguistics essentially depended on notions of meaning. So they would have to do substitution, which kept something constant, which was generally keeping meaning constant. So notions of synonymy became extremely important. That notion of synonymy, however, came under withering attack by Quine in the mid-1950s, and the locus of that was a paper called The Problem of Meaning in Linguistics, which first appeared in his book From a Logical Point of View. Chomsky was very influenced by this paper. He apparently heard it Quine presented when he was still a student at Penn. In it, Quine argues that there's no notion of meaning, particularly no notion of meaning meeting empiricist standards, such that it's going to found a notion of synonymy that will be sufficient for the taxonomic procedures. And Quine's response to this is, well, so much the worse for linguistics, because he really had no idea. He was thinking of linguistics as structural linguistics. Chomsky saw it as liberating, completely liberating, that you could simply reject meaning correctly, and that meaning had no role to play, okay, in this construction. So if you think about the levels, there's no semantic level. He does not give a semantic level. And there's a question, can there even be a semantic level of linguistic description as per generative linguistics as characterized in LSLT? And the question would be, what would be the primes, because there'd have to be a level, and what would be the rules? And it's very, very unclear what they would be. And I really don't know of any real effort to do that, to actually construct that, perhaps outside of Jerry Katz's book, Semantic Theory. One may think of that in this way. But I think the important point here is that semantics is not part of the definition of language. Remember, the construction of levels is to give this system of definitions which are to characterize what a language, what the nature of human language, give a definition of human language. So what this follows is semantics is not part of the definition of language. Our theoretical answer to the question of what a language is does not provide any direct answer to the question of what sentences of a language mean. Now, Chomsky was not insensitive to the issues of meaning. I mean, he, as we said, this is all emerging in this milieu, which he is deeply embedded in, of philosophical thought in which issues of meaning were central relative to the concerns about science. And here's what he says about this matter. We are studying language as an instrument or a tool, attempting to describe its structure with no explicit reference to the way in which this instrument is put to use. The motivation for this self-imposed formality requirement for grammars is quite simple. There seems to be no other basis that will yield a rigorous, effective, and revealing theory of linguistic structure. The requirement that this theory shall be a completely formal discipline is perfectly compatible with the desire to formulate it in such a way as to have a suggestive and significant interconnections with a parallel semantic theory. What we pointed out is that this formal study of the structure of language as an instrument may be expected to provide insight into the actual use of language, that is, the process of understanding sentences. Now, there's a lot in this. There is a lot packed into this comment, both historically and about the way Chomsky himself has seen the relation between syntax and semantics. But I think one thing that it implies, and it's sort of why I sort of added this emphasis, is that we want to think of semantic theory, how it's constituted, as an interface with the theory of linguistic structure, or what I'll just sometimes call linguistic theory. And one way that has become very sort of dominant and motivating in the way to see this interface was that syntax outputs a formal object that are inputs to semantics. And somehow there's something that's outputted sort of like a machine that comes out of the semantics and is taken in by the syntax and is taken in by the semantics and interpreted by the semantics. In this regard, the interface was seen as very tight. There's a very tight interface between syntax and semantics, such that syntactic structure would be directly expressing compositional structure, and that it would give us the structure required for the application of semantic/logical rules. Now, this kind of notion, I think, came really to be very animated, certainly it was for me, in the context of what I think about as the second great phase, research phase in generative grammar. The first phase would be figuring out the nature of rule systems and how they function, which came to fruition in Hadj-Ross's dissertation as the sort of ultimate sort of defining moment. And then it moved on to a second great research project, what I'll call the Anaphora project. I'm looking for better terms if anyone has one, The Anaphora project starts to build up a head of steam in the late 1960s and really, I think, completely dominates work in syntax in many different ways, right through to the mid-1980s when a different research project starts to emerge. And to just summarize what the content of the Anaphora project is, as broadly as possible, I think the main animating notion was the unification of pronominal anaphora and syntactic movement. The fundamental notion of this project was clear. The notion was C-command. That was the central theoretical notion, beginning at the notion of command, Howard Lasnik's modification of K-command, and then the sort of stable notion of C-command developed in Tanya Reinhardt's dissertation. And this led ultimately in the arc of thinking, particularly pertaining to anaphora, to the binding theory, which emerges in Chomsky's work in the mid-1980s. And part of the power of this project and why it was so important is that it really gave rise to a notion of linguistic law that strongly supported poverty of the stimulus arguments and really gave sort of real theoretical foundation to the kinds of conceptual structure that the theory was giving forth as a view of human language and human cognition. And so these conditions, proper binding conditions, adjacency, et cetera, there were various others, were important because they were very abstract. They were not mere statements of empirical generalizations. They were highly abstract principles, highly structural, and things which would not be learnable under any traditional empiricist notions of learning. Now, into this mix entered the notion of logical form in the mid-1970s. And in particular, in my work, first in my dissertation in Grammar of Quantification in 1977, and in my book, Logical Form, Its Structure and Derivation, where the idea being that the syntax actually specified a logical structure for language. This is really a great thing, that what people thought about as a particular logical structure was actually manifest in the syntax of natural languages. Now, to me personally, there were a lot of things that I was interested in, but with respect to quantifiers and the introduction of the work I was doing there and the introduction of QR, clearly there was a lot of thinking going on at the time. There had been the discussions in generative semantics of quantifier lowering and issues of quantifier scope in the work of George Lakoff and Jim Macaulay. Certainly Montague grammar was very strongly in the air after the 1974 Summer Linguistics Institute at UMass, where that was really introduced as a approach to linguistics. That was very much in the air. There were a couple of dissertations that were floating around that I found very enlightening, in particular by Tony Kroc and by Georgette Ayuk. However, I think a lot of these things I found, a lot of other work I found a little confusing because it seemed to me we were emerging from this idea that had sort of emerged initially in the mid-1960s as a kind of deep structure, that level, a syntactic level, that's kind of the semantic level, which seemed to me very much to confuse issues of logical structure and logical form with issues of conceptual meaning. That these things were getting mixed together, even though we had clear views of the lexicon, and the lexicon is a focus of conceptual meaning. What we didn't really have is a clear notion of how to express logical structure, or should it even be represented within syntax. Personally, my biggest influences were really the philosophical influences. My influences in trying to look at the particular things I looked at and the way I looked at things, aside from being immersed in this Anaphora project, were really with the traditional work of Frege, Russell, Tarski, Quine, et cetera, and the work they had done. And I was much more channeling things from that direction. So in the mid-1970s, we were working on that in my dissertation. And of course, the other main document I'll come back to later in 1976 was Chomsky's paper, Conditions on Rules of Grammar, which also began it, and the discussions which Chomsky and I were having at the time. Okay. Now, in introducing QR at this time, there were a number of very general meta-theoretical motivations. The first was the rule could be introduced with no extensions to the theory but yet we would get an increase in empirical depth. Introducing a new level did not change or was not a greater cost to the theory. The number of levels is simply just given by the theory. 2 versus 3 is not anything which changes anything. So the theory had no extension, and QR was overtly modeled in all the discussions on WH movement. So the idea was whatever you needed for WH movement is what you needed for QR. In my dissertation, I think was really the first time was really to look at the question and say that this rule was subject to syntactic conditions which were governing movement rules in general, okay? And moreover, to argue, that the notions that govern proper movement and anaphora also govern scope, that is C command, so that we could simply define scope, A as scope over B, if and only if A C commands B. Now, there were a lot of cases for motivating LF, in particular having to do with QR. Let me just run through some of these. I think you're probably familiar with most of them, but all of these, I think, really were very, very, really interesting and important. The first one had to do with antecedent-contained deletion. Sentences like Dulles suspected everyone that Angleton did. This is generally credited to a paper by a linguist named Lawrence Boughton. I don't know if he did any other work. It was in either I think a CLS paper in about 1970. It was early on. Others looked at it, in particular Ivan Sog and Edwin Williams had looked at it in the work they were doing on ellipsis. But it really became a central case with respect to the motivations of QR, and I'll return to that case in a moment. The other case, which I'm going to return to in a moment, of course, was the one I talked about primarily in my dissertation, the relative scope of quantifiers in cases like everyone saw someone and all sorts of other sorts of relevant cases. A third case that was highly motivating was bound variable anaphora. Cases like every pilot hit some MiG that chased him. And here, of course, the relevant observation is that bound variable anaphora was dependent on quantifier scope. So if the existential quantifier took broader scope over the universal, we would not get bound variable anaphora. We'd have to have the universal have broader scope. So that was another phenomenon which seemed to very much tie into the picture. The other, again, about the relation of anaphora and movement was crossover phenomena. This was the main topic of discussion in conditions rules of grammar. And of course, they came in two flavors, the strong cases, she saw everyone versus whom did she see, which are both do not allow for the pronoun to be through the bound variable. And the weak cases, her friend saw everyone and whom did her friend see. And of course, he's contrasted with cases with proper names. Case of crossing co-reference, or known as Bach-Peters sentences, every pilot who shot at it hit some MiG that chased him. Again, I'll come back to that, so I'll come back to that case in a moment. Then there were cases of inverse linking. Somebody from every city despises it. This case actually first came to my attention in a paper by Jaakko Hintikka, which appeared in Linguistic Inquiry, in which he wasn't so much concerned with the inverse ordering of the quantifiers, but with what he called branching quantifiers. Or the scope independence. But this case was, of course, a very central and important case for understanding the focus of QR, that the embedded quantifier could have scope outside as witnessed by its binding the pronoun in object position. The lowering cases, every spy is likely to be apprehended, where the quantifier can have the ambiguous, in particular, can have scope within the scope of likely, basically be lowered down to its position from whence it was raised to have scope inside. Then there were cases like negative polarity. This is an observation that was due to Bill Lagisaw. No student who ever read anything about phrenology attended any of Gall's lectures, in which the head determiner has to pay downward entailing, and that this has interacted with scope. And finally, there were the cases which I refer to as kind of the covert movement cases. And these most well known, I think, were the discussion of Chinese WH questions by Jim Wang, and also the discussion of Spanish clitics by Osvaldo Yeagley were early and very, very important discussions and the ideas about covert movement. But there was one very general argument as well, and which this contributed to, and this was really the contribution to poverty of the stimulus arguments as a more general theoretical argument. And here, I'm going to quote Jim Higginbotham because I think he really just captures the issue, the claim right on, spot on. Within a program of research that aims at comprehending the basis of human linguistic knowledge, the properties of LF may be of particular interest, especially if LF structures differ significantly from S structures. For in that case, the remoteness of logical forms from the structures of sentences actually heard will tend to make the relation between the evidence available to the child on the one hand and the properties of the system grasped on the other so tenuous that we would expect the evidential gap to be closed largely by unlearned principles of grammar. A good working hypothesis is the shape of LF is the same for all languages, apart from meaning fixing apart from the meaning of lexical items, and that is the hypothesis that I shall adopt here. Okay, so let's look at look briefly at some of the importance of some of the cases here and some of the moves that were made about these cases, in particular some of the moves I made in my two approaches to this. So the first is the ambiguity of everyone saw someone. And this was to be accomplished by two applications of QR adjoining to the S node, to the highest root node. And this would just be, the two forms would be given as I've shown in 1 and 2. And this would give different scopes as determined by C command. And each of the quantifiers would bind variables, where variables would be the traces left over by the syntactic movement. So this really took advantage of sort of a lot of developments, obviously the developments about WH movement, the developments about adjunction, developments about trace theory, which really had been developed between Joe Emmons's ideas about structure preservation and Bob Fiengo's developments of the idea of trace theory in his dissertation. Then, so this was the view I had and developed in my dissertation. Then in logical form, in 1985, I changed things, particularly under changing the notion from C command to M command, the notion emerging from the work of Joseph Aoun and Dominique Sportiche, in which the calculations were in terms of projections of categories rather than simply branching nodes. Okay, and I observed that, well, QR as an adjunction is not to be structure building, that the structure that you get by these copyings doesn't give you sort of more categories. It's all kind of one. And that adjunction was to be structure neutral. And that meant that 1 and 2 represent only absolute scope, not relative scope, because both of the adjoined elements, everyone is someone, mutually C command each other. So neither C commands the other, but both C command all the other stuff in the matrix sentence. So there's a notion of relative scope, not absolute scope. And the idea was to ask, well, look, how much of structure of logical structure needs to be represented syntactically? And the observation was that the rules that are going to interpret these sentences, the semantic rules, already embed a recursive procedure, which are going to disambiguate. So we just let the semantic quantifier clauses and the standard methods of Tarskian methods, for example, and that will disambiguate either 1 or 2, which would be equivalent derivations under this view. So this insight, this newer development of M command, the idea that adjunction is not a structure building operation, it's structure neutral, gave this kind of result. Now, this also went along with ideas that, articulation of ideas that I'd had, particularly through discussions with Jim Higginbotham, that changed my view about kind of what LF was trying to do, what we're trying to do in constructing LF. In my dissertation, it was really to give logical form in the notion of inference, that it was there to basically specify the inferential structure. And people, for example, I think Peter Ludlow have taken it this way to try and use it as a notion of developing kind of natural logic, that actually you need to have disambiguation at the syntactic level. My orientation in logical form changed to trying to say, well, how is this characterizing truth conditions? What is the input to the determination of truth conditions? And it's really this view that kind of Jim Higginbotham and I were talking about, starting with our paper, and then we wrote questions, quantifiers, and crossing. And again, I think Jim put it nicely. So let me quote from the same paper by Jim Higginbotham about this latter move. So a picture of LF that might be expressed succinctly by saying that LF representations instantiate the schemata of generalized quantification theory, which is devoted to characterizing the truth conditions of quantified sentences. May's QR is not only the sort of rule we should expect if this picture is approximately correct, it's virtually the only sort of rule available or needed. So that was the picture we were kind of looking at the time of trying to characterize how the syntax was determining a structure appropriate for determination of truth conditions, as opposed to determining directly for inference. Okay, so now let's turn to antecedent contained deletion. I have to admit, I think this is an argument I've always really deeply and truly loved more than any other. And it's, I think, one of great elegance. And the reason I really like this argument is because it's really a purely theoretical argument. It's really about sort of the nature of the theory and it's the way it works. So if we take a sentence like Dulles suspected everyone and Angleton did too, you know, I mean, the naive way of thinking about it, which gets worked out in a number of different ways in literature, is that, you know, you just take the missing verb phrase that's been elided and you stick the antecedent one back in under identity, so that what you do in interpreting that sentence is you get to Dulles suspected everyone and Angleton suspected everyone. And by you just reconstruct, delete, whatever you want, how you're ever going to do it. But the important point is it's under identity. And of course, why the under identity part was so interesting was because of the strict and sloppy anaphora phenomena, which you know, was widely discussed and which Bob Fiengo and I discussed at great length in our book, Indices and Identity. But the idea is that this relationship is a relationship under syntactic identity, however you're going to characterize that notion. The ACD case would now be Dulles suspected everyone that Angleton did. And if we just take kind of this naive view that we're just reconstructing that VP, we get Dulles suspected everyone that Angleton suspected everyone that Angleton did. We've got that elided Pelliston again, we'd have to do it again. And obviously we would get no definite finite syntactic structure. And that seemed to be a very significant theoretical problem, that you'd have sentences which do not have any definite structure, right? We could not specify a definite structure for them. Well, the answer, and the elegant answer, was that, well, QR comes into play. So from everyone that Angleton did, we move the phrase everyone that Angleton did, getting everyone that Angleton did, Dulles suspected trace. Then we do reconstruction, perfectly fine, and we get everyone that Angleton suspected, Dulles suspected. And we have a properly well-formed structure, a properly formed finite structure. So the interest of antecedent contained deletion is that it gave a deep theoretical argument for the existence of LF movement. And that's why I think it's very important, and why it sort of remains important, even though I know people have very different views and there's a lot of development of ideas about this, but you have to react to this. That's what people are reacting to, is this particular set of reasons and what's going on with antecedent contained deletion. Now, the other case that I want to discuss briefly is crossing coreference. And I mean, this was a case that, one of the reasons I shied away from, in my dissertation, from talking very much about Anaphora is because I found these cases really, really hard to understand. I really couldn't figure them out. And the problem was that in the cases of every pilot who shot it, it hit some MiG that chased him, which actually was not discussed in the original papers, in the initial discussion by Bach and Peters. They only discussed definite descriptions. And this was when Higginbotham and I started dealing with it, we went to immediately this case because this is the really interesting case, because we do get asymmetry of scope. So we can understand it with either the every phrase or the some phrase with broader scope. But regardless of which scope we have, you get bound variable anaphora either way. We get the cross binding either way, regardless of the scope. But if scope has to be in order, if scope is strictly ordered in logical form, that wouldn't be possible because of the C command effect of bound variable anaphora. So that's why these cases were really, really interesting. And so what Jim and I did is that we posed what we called absorbed binary quantifiers. And we said, well, look, there was kind of a syntactic readjustment that took these two things and kind of glommed them into one. But that the semantics, we then innovated in the semantics to be able to give these absorbed quantifiers as a development in generalized quantifier theory, such that embedded into the definitions of the absorbed quantifiers would be a preservation of quantifier scope. So the scope would be expressed in the semantics of the absorbed quantifiers, but the binding we could do by having this absorption process, which admittedly was ad hoc, but which was important. And it's been taken up as kind of an independent syntactic phenomenon by many people in the literature, that there is this kind of absorption effect that we get, although we took it as kind of ad hoc when we did it. But you can see the two kind of logical forms that we posited there. In my book, however, one of the big arguments I gave was that absorption could simply be subsumed under M command. That since the way we're seeing now, all of the ones that were stacked up, all the quantifier phrases that were stacked up and joined to a particular S node, all would mutually C command one another. There would be no problem in getting the binding, and we would just, as would normally be, that would just go into the semantics, which would be the semantics of Higginbotham and May, which would give absorbed quantifiers. So these cases were also extremely interesting because they seem to pose this problem for this generalization, but which had a kind of elegant solution. Now, okay, so that's sort of it. Now, how am I doing? Oh, good, just a few closing remarks. I want to close here with just some speculations and some thoughts. About the notion of the tight interface, because I think if one just observes, I don't think that many people who are working either in syntax or semantics really believe in that anymore. There is this kind of really very, very tight interface, or don't practice that way. I don't know if they believe in it or not, but they don't seem to practice in that way. And let me give one last quote from going back to the 1950s from Chomsky. This is from Syntactic Structures. What we're suggesting is that the notion of understanding a sentence will be explained in part by the terms of the notion linguistic level. To understand a sentence, then, it is first necessary to reconstruct its analysis on each linguistic level. We can test the adequacy of a given set of abstract linguistic levels by asking whether or not grammars formulated in terms of these levels enable us to provide a satisfactory analysis of the notion of understanding. Now, given this, we can give a little bit somewhat different picture, right? We don't have to take it that linguistic theory has outputs, some kind of formal syntactic objects that are inputs to semantic theory, okay? We can look at things a little bit differently. That syntax is part of linguistic theory, that is part of the theory defining what a language is. It has a mode of representation that's to be understood simply within that context as the representation of derivations. That's it. That may involve covert movement, but not necessarily provide any objects of interpretation. So syntax is a much more encapsulated enterprise. It's the notion of linguistic levels that characterizes linguistic theory. There is syntactic levels, and that insofar as we're going to take that and put that into a notion of understanding, it has to be done holistically. We have to take linguistic theory holistically to embed it in a more broad notion of understanding. So in this view, semantic theory would be distinct from linguistic theory. Okay? Semantic theory would be concerned with questions of what sentences mean, not what is a sentence. And it would come up with its mode of representations appropriate to the context of answering that question and not this other question. But within semantic theory, the notion of sentence, that is the one which is going to be characterized by linguistic theory, can be taken as a primitive. There's no explanation of what sentences are, only an explication of the role they play in the theory of determining what they mean. The explication may be ultimately justified by linguistic theory as a locus of explanation, that it is to explain that sentences have certain syntactic properties. We look there. So semantic theory may be informationally dependent on linguistic theory and to give aspects of the formal structure as this is pertinent to their interpretation. So the idea is to kind of, mimic this idea of these independent levels, each of which is characterizing or defining a notion, such as it becomes something which would be primitive at other levels, but which the explication you'd go for the explication of the notion down to other levels, to kind of take that up to a broader level of a more broad semiotic theory, a more broad theory of language in general. So which we may think of as taken up with linguistic theory, semantic theory, psycholinguistic theory, and so on. Each of these theories are independent of one another. Each has their own defining questions and methods of research, issues of notation, and so on. And what is primitively presupposed may be explicated and justified by explanations within the other theories. The theories may be informationally dependent, but there may be more labile relations of explanation. So we may find explanations in semantic theory for things that are phenomenal in linguistic theory. That would be possible. And the interface question would now be about loose interfaces, not tight interfaces. So I think psycholinguistics, for example, and syntax, for example, now have a very loose interface. It's a very loose interface, and it'll be more like that. So that's just some ideas that we might think about when we try to think about what's going on in contemporary work, as we think about the relation to what was going on in what I call the Anaphora project. So now, just as a last sort of moment of conclusion, I want to just take a moment to sort of acknowledge, since this is a look back, to acknowledge just some of the people who I was thinking of working with, was influenced by, who helped me out in many ways, who saw the value in the ideas back when they were coming forward. And if I leave any, some of these people are on here, and I hope I got you all, because you were all on my list anyway. But I hope I don't miss anybody. First, and these were all people who really were, first group of people who were really around MIT when I was a graduate student, came back a little bit as a visitor. I know Howard's there. Howard was a great influence, a bit of an elder statesman because he'd gotten his degree a whole year before I got there, and seemed like an elder statesman. Other people, Gary Milsark, Tanya Reinhardt, Ivan Sog and Edwin Williams, Norbert Hornstein, Bob Frieden, Richie Kane, Jacqueline Garon. These were all people who I talked to a lot, really greatly influenced my thinking, helped me get off bad ideas onto good ideas, which are very important. Visitors who came later, people came to MIT later, Richard Larson, Irena Heim, and Barry Shine, where my work was rather more mature, with great influences on me. My teachers at MIT, all the people at MIT at the time, of course, Noam. Noam and I talked a lot about it. I moved recently, and when you move, you unearth things, and I actually unearthed the typescript of my PhD dissertation, which in those days you gave to a typist. You paid a typist to type up the official version, and I found sort of a whole sheath of letters from Noam, with nuanced, tiny little criticisms of things to think about, all typewritten. And of course, Sylvan Bromberger, who was an enormous influence on me my whole life, was always a great influence on me, and talked about everything with Sylvan, of content, philosophy, life, love, everything with Sylvan. Wonderful, wonderful person. I finally have to thank two people, and really, ultimately, more than anybody. First was Jim Higginbotham. I first met Jim after I moved to New York, after I finished my PhD thesis for my postdoc at Rockefeller University with George Miller. And I got in touch with Bob Fiengo, and I said, Bob, anybody I should meet here in New York? And he said, you got to meet this guy Higginbotham. I said, okay. So we get together, I think actually at Fiengo's place, and Jim had read my dissertation, and we just immediately fell into discussion and talking about things. And he was just hooked in from this very philosophical perspective, very semantic perspective. And we started working together. Those of you who know Jim knew he was a chain smoker, and I had a closet, windowless office at the time, and Jim and I would work together, him chain smoking. And so, we'd do things, go and play softball afterwards. But I learned so much from Jim. And he so helped me articulate my ideas, and so much of what I've thought about, both positively and critically of his own work, just are things that I just learned from him. A deep, deep, deep thinker and an amazing person. Lastly, I have to give my biggest thanks to Bob Fiengo. Bob and I wrote 2 books together. I've talked to Bob Fiengo about linguistics more than any other person. We talked about everything. And I can't even start to begin to say what I learned from Bob and how much he influenced my work. I loved working with him. I'm very proud of the work we did together. I think it's great work. It really it meant an enormous amount to me. So with that, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks for taking time out of your Saturday afternoons and mornings, evenings to come to this. I'm very, very honored to be the first speaker. I'm really looking forward to hearing my friends, all of the speakers who are coming forthwith are my friends. I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. And I want to thank Leah and Clay again for starting this and a tradition of all of us trying to look back at the foundations of our field, how it came to be, and why it's such an extraordinary investigation into the most fundamental things of humanity. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. It's great.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share, but I can go back if anybody wants to refer to any of the slides so I can see more people.
That's fantastic. Yes, so now we can see everybody. That's great. Turn your cameras on. And Lydia, you're going to take over?
I thought you were, but sure.
Oh, okay.
No, I can do it and you can jump in later if you like. So we are going to start questions and would like to invite junior people first to ask questions. Anybody who would like to ask questions? There are no silly questions, no dumb questions. Every question is a great question, so just ask it.
And you can, yes, and you can use the chat as well. So I monitor the chat. That's yeah.
Yeah, Clay's going to monitor the chat
here,
and I'm going to see your raised
I'm also looking
hands.
at YouTube and Facebook. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, you are? Okay. Okay.
In case there's anybody.
I'm not, so good that you're monitoring that. We see one raised hand from Megan. Go ahead, Megan. Please unmute yourself.
You're muted.
Yeah, strangely, it doesn't look like she's muted, but
No.
something is with the sound. Can you post it in chat and we'll read it for you? Can you post it in chat?
Okay, students, junior researchers, don't be shy. Okay.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity to learn from the best directly.
So there's a question in the chat. Should I take that or?
Yes,
sure.
Yes, this is.
So Will is asking, can you explain a bit more what you mean by tight versus loose interfaces, please?
Okay, well, so a tight interface, I mean, there's, in the sense I was describing, there's, if we think just about logic, we think about having a syntax that then specifies a class of forms, and those forms are then interpreted by what the rules are, by the semantic rules, okay? Interpretation is specified for them. So that we can actually kind of read off, as an input from the input, sort of we read off the compositional structure. What it's giving you is sort of a guide to how to compose, how it's a guide to the applications of the rules, the semantic rules. So that there's a kind of literal output that's then kind of the input object that the semantics is then working on, okay? That's what I mean by a tight interface. So the information, the compositional information, the binding information, the scope information, all of that information is information that is read, if you will, by the next interface, by the semantics in this case. By a loose interface, I mean something more like, when I do psycholinguistics, I have a notion of a sentence. I have notions of structural notions that are important. My my probes and my experiments are maybe looking at sort of depending upon certain syntactic aspects, but I'm not thinking that I take as a whole the structure that's given with all of its information into the psycholinguistics. I'm leaving the explication of the syntactic structure to the syntax. That's its business. So my interface is that I'm using a notion, so to speak, I'm assuming or presupposing a notion of sentence in my psycholinguistic research as specified within this overall theory, within the my best linguistic theory, my best syntax. But I'm not sort of having this sort of tight input-output relation. The things that are given to me, that there are things. In fact, arguably, there are no things that are given to us sort of outputted from linguistic theory at all. All it gives us is a definition, which gives us representations of sentences of language, defines that notion. There's no thing, it's not like a machine that's sort of chugging along, giving us an output, a thing, and then we take this thing, we do things to it. That's kind of the tight but wrong model, or other model, I should say. It's rather for explanation of what a sentence is, well, look to the theory that explains what a sentence is. But relative, presupposed to that explanation, I utilize the notion of sentence within my theory. So within linguistic theory, as Chomsky describes it in LSLT, I take it that these levels have a loose relation, by the way I'm thinking about it. They are loosely related, okay? So at the level of syntax, I'm not looking to trying to give or characterize really much about the definition of what a word is. I'm simply taking the notion of that words are primitive, as specified in the lexicon. And we see that in the early grammars. We see that going on where, we just have N rewrites as John, for example, and so on. So that's the idea I have in mind in the sort of loose versus a tight interface, where we're just sort of looking at it in the loose notion as sort of the interaction of related sciences or related domains of inquiry around a sort of common set of assumptions about what is being investigated and what counts as explanation of phenomena in that domain.
All right, now Megan, maybe you can try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yay, great. I figured it out. Thank you very much. My name's Megan Fowley. I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University. I don't know, does that make me junior enough for this round?
You're perfect. Go ahead.
All right, great.
Enough for now.
I think from our point of view, yes.
All right, excellent. So I actually have a question, somewhat along similar lines. So I was thinking about these levels of representation and the notion of a primitive, and before you get to this syntax versus semantics point, these aren't just primitives in the definitional sense. It's not like we just don't care what makes a word, but they're also sort of like I want to say algebra constants. Right, they're the actual, like, sort of almost like physical primitives, the things you're putting together. We don't care what they're made out of. We just put them together to make a sentence. We just put the phonemes together to make a morpheme, etc. But this isn't really true once you get to the syntax versus semantics, right? At this point, it's not like we're doing propositional semantics, right? We actually have some kind of a compositional semantics. So we're actually interested in the pieces of the sentence. We're interested not just a sentence as an atom, let's say. So so I'm kind of wondering if you can say something about these sort of different notions of primitive and how this would work.
Okay, well, the notion of primitive here is notion of that Chomsky uses of prime. I think, let me say I understand your point, and I think it's a good point. When we go to a particular level, okay, we can say if we're at the level of syntax, or the level of the phrase, okay, and we say, okay, when we take a phrase, we are taking words, or particularly, words categorized in a certain way, and we're putting them together to form phrases, okay? What we're not giving, all we're giving, though, is analysis of the notion of phrase. And our analysis of definition of phrase says, given a set of primes, and we have an overall theoretical understanding of what can constitute those primes, and rules, particular rules given in a particular normal form, okay, what's going to be the class of phrases, okay? So it would not be appropriate if I'm giving you an account of phrases and I say, here, I take the words and I put them together, or I take the categories, put them together, to ask me, well, what's a word? And I say, that's just not a relevant question, okay? If you're asking me that in the domain, in the context of more general linguistic theory, I'll say, well, okay, well, look at the level at which we characterize words, okay? And then you'll look and you'll see what the theory says, characterizes as a class of words in the language. So I think that's the notion of primitive. Now, if I understood your point, when we get to the relationship between syntax and semantics, it's different. We're looking at this entire structure, the entire derivation, the entire structure, and we're looking at its properties, including its very global properties, okay? So things are very different. And as I said, what we conspicuously do not see in the LSLT structure or after that is an explicitly semantic level. We don't see a level of semantics, right? And I think the question is, well, it's not really clear, and I think maybe there aren't any way to characterize what the primes would be and the rules that would sort of give you the right kind of outputs, okay? So I think that you're right. When we get to the relation between syntax and semantics, things differ, okay? Now, if we're looking at it as sort of, semantic theory, as an independent enterprise, we ask, well, what notion sentence do they use? Well, they're going to, appropriate notions of sentence. And they will say things about sentences which they think are necessary to get the right meanings out. And then you have to sort of look and see, given the notion of sentence they're using and the primitive notions they're doing, how does that relate back? Okay, and maybe it gives a better explanation of certain things that, seem to be syntactic phenomena. So for example, one case of that would be, that one possible case of that would be polarity distribution, kind of the way that Lagisol looked at it. There was a semantic property of downward entailingness, and that sort of had this syntactic effect of this syntactic distribution. So I think that what we're trying to sort of figure out here, in which we had a very clear view of what we were doing in the 1970s and 1980s and later, but which seems to, I don't know, maybe, as I said, at least in practice, seems to be very different in the way things have evolved, was this very tight relationship. That syntax really was, what you're getting was the compositional structure with the binding properties, with the scope properties, and those were sort of transparently going right on into the semantic rules. Does that help?
That was great. Thank you. Anybody else from the junior people? Carolyn, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Carolyn Zaramba and I work at the University of Krakow. And I'm actually not a syntactician, so I'm just here to spy on you guys. I had a question. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the talk and for the idea of the series. This is really great, and thank you so much also to the organizers as well. So it's such a great opportunity, such an honor. And now to the question. I'm not sure if I'm not maybe skipping ahead. I hope maybe this will be covered in a future talk, a future reflection, if you will. But I would like to ask you about your take on the challenges to the poverty of the stimulus argument. Because I read some research that said basically that, the stimulus is not as poor as Chomsky was, kind of selling it to be, making it out to be. And I was just wondering if you have some thoughts on that, or maybe it will be covered in a future talk. I would really, like to hear this.
Well, that is a talk by someone. Maybe even I would talk about that.
Okay.
There are others like Bob Berwick who would be the person to really talk about that. I don't believe there have been any serious challenges to the stimulus of the poverty of the stimulus arguments. I think you're intimating that how are we to think about large language models and what they're supposed to be doing in terms of modeling, or are they supposed to be in any way really modeling natural language? I think we have to sort of start to understand what arguments that were given relative to poverty of stimulus that are in principle. And it also, what's the nature of abstract principles and what does it mean to come to know an abstract principle? I haven't read deeply in some of this literature, but the things I have read seem to, take big inferential leaps from, certain kinds of effects that are gotten often out of large language models to claiming explanation of principles, and with a lot of gaps, inferential gaps in the argument. I mean, one kind of thing that is interesting is, in syntactic structures, Chomsky undertakes an argument, which I really do believe Chomsky thought to be an in-principle argument against the inability of stochastic modeling probabilistic methods to account for human language. He took that to be in principle. And now, I don't think it's seen that way. I think the argument is now seen as a practical argument. So along the following lines, in 1957, to increase computing capacity, to increase your computing resources was extremely expensive. If you wanted a small increase in computing power, that was extremely expensive. So when you thought about issues, you thought about them, how do you think about things that work as efficiently as possible? Efficiency was very high for computation. And doing sort of probabilistic reasoning computationally is a huge resource hog, an enormous resource hog. Well, today, getting more computational resources is basically free. You need more chips for your memory, costs virtually nothing, okay? So the issue of computational capacity is not seen as an issue anymore. So types of computer programming and computer modeling, which are done today, people don't think about. All the question today is, how close can you get to the latency between, when we speak, the comprehension latency between when you and I speak and when you deal with, Siri, or some kind of, AI. What's the latency? And can you get that latency to basically be as close as possible to the latency that occurs in human communication? Okay. Now, under the hood, we're trying to create products. And under the hood is a whole different thing. Okay. So I think that the issue of, is large, language modeling, is that, something about human language? I don't know. Probably not. But it does really tell a very different of approach to the way we think about human cognition and what it means to be language processing. So I think the question you bring up is very important, and I think it's obviously one of great contemporary interest. But I think, again, I think you're right. I think it'd be great to get someone like Bob Berwick on this to really talk about that, because I think it's a great topic to discuss.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? What we usually do in this case, Charles, yeah, we're gonna open it up to everybody now, and then we'll come back to juniors again, because sometimes they need a little bit of time to think. So, yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I'm Charles Reese. I'm definitely not junior, but okay. But I'm not. But I'm a phonologist, so that's almost as good as being junior. So I was just wondering if you could go over the content of slide 23 a little bit more with the two, the someone, and everyone ambiguity. I didn't quite understand how the issue was solved. It was slide 23. Right.
So this is just the classic case of QR, where you start from everyone loves someone, appropriately bracketed, and then QR can, by two iterations, it adjoins each of these phrases to S, but it does it in different orders. And since it does it in different orders, given just standard branching node C command, it'll come out that the first one, everyone will have broader scope over someone, and in the second one, someone will have broader scope over everyone.
Yeah, so that part I get, but then I didn't get where you went from there with the M command.
Oh, well, in M command, the way M command works is that in the configurations in slide 23, the two adjoined quantifier phrases M command each other. Okay, so they're symmetrical. They're no longer asymmetrical. They're no longer asymmetrical. They're now symmetrical. Okay. So there's no relative scope relation between them, because if scope is determined by command, see M command now, they both M command the matrix sentence, but
so I didn't.
So why? Yes.
So why did you want to do that?
Well, crossing coreference. Okay. It gave an elegant solution to the crossing coreference, and it sort of gave an approach to a more general question of, given that the interpretive rules are going to have built into them a recursive procedure, right? It basically keeps fixed. It only can do one quantifier at a time, and it does it sequentially to give the differential scope readings. Let's let it do its work, okay, over this sequence, and because it has to order out in the procedures of the semantic rules, have to themselves have an order. You just take that order as the appropriate, basically, scoping order for meaning, and you don't have to represent that directly in the syntax. No reason to do that, right? So you don't have to represent that part of compositional structure. But for all the things that have to do with anaphoric binding and compound variable anaphora, you do need that M command relation, okay? It also allowed a much more elegant account of the inverse linking facts as well. The inverse linking, they worked out a little more elegantly as well. But the main motivating case was the crossing coreference case, to get the symmetry of binding, but yet the asymmetry of scope.
Thank you.
Great. Anybody else? Tariq?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a graduate student of general linguistics in Hamburg, Germany, and I have a bit of a stupid question. It might just show how
Never a stupid question.
how few I still have to understand of this. If you look on your slide 27, it says that linguistic theory has no outputs that are inputs to semantic theory. I get why you have to keep syntax and semantics apart somehow, and if you say understanding a sentence on the semantic level has to be kept apart from syntax, but what else is there for semantics to interpret if not the output of the syntactic module? So if we get the sentences and we have to interpret the structure to make sure that it's an adequate sentence in the given language, and then I suppose that afterwards we interpret what the single parts of the sentence mean if they're in correct structure. So isn't that supposed to be an input to the semantic module of any kind?
Well, look at it this way. Syntax, particularly with inflectional morphology, can be concerned with the internal structure of words. Okay, I mean, that's, look at, all the work in relation between inflectional morphology and syntactic movement, going all the way back to affix hopping in syntactic structure. So there's certainly, for any given level of analysis, it can look into all aspects of the internal structure as specified elsewhere in the overall theory. So of course, in this sort of other conception that I'm sort of envisaging or looking at as possible, it can look into the internal structure of sentences as specified by the theory of sentences. And in that regard, it has access to that information. It's not that it's not able to look at that information and make use of that information, okay? It's what I'm trying to sort of get away from is this kind of, machine sort of analogy, that sort of things are output, but then go input, which then get output. I'm trying to get away from that kind of analogy of thinking about the theory, that the theory itself is the theory of what is a sentence. That's what it's defining for us. That's what it gives us. So really, we have to think of the theory as a whole, and we can, in fact, make reference in other theories to the properties that are determined, right? And incorporate that into the way that theory is representing, the way it's constructing its principles and rules and so on. That's all perfectly possible. But it's not, what I'm trying to get away from is the analogy of sort of taking this object which is presented to me, qua object, and then saying, aha, I then sort of work on that. Okay, that's this sort of analogy I'm trying to get away from. But it's not to say that there's no discourse between these various approaches. Not at all. That's part of the whole power of it as an overall theory of language, is that the various parts can. Look at psycholinguistics. If psycholinguistics couldn't discourse with linguistic theory and syntax, it wouldn't be interesting. I mean, that's obviously what it has to make use of.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Richard.
I have a minor quibble with slide 16, the one called formal valuation of grammars. In calculating the value of grammar 2, I noticed that you ignored the parentheses.
I did, and the arrow too.
Right. Now, my recollection of discussions from way back then was that picking an evaluation metric was itself considered to be an empirical question. That is, what of various conceivable evaluation metrics, there was the idea that one might be better than another one. So in attaching no weight to parentheses, you're picking one kind of evaluation metric in a way that might be fine, but I was struck by the way you did it. More interesting as a comment is that on slide 19, you have at the bottom, in talking about proper binding conditions, subjacency, etc., abstract, not statements of empirical generalizations. I don't see that distinction very clearly. It seems to me, I mean, it's clear that subjacency was an advance over Ross's multiple constraints from 5 or so years before that. But I don't see why you couldn't think of subjacency as a complex statement of empirical generalizations. I don't see how you can define abstractness in the way that I think you would like to.
Okay, so first question, first observation. Standardly, in these kinds of evaluations of formal systems, the notational conventions are not taken as part of what's counted. And I think if you look at what Noam says in that part earlier, I think that's implied. It's the actual elements of the rules that you're going to count. But I mean, even so, if you want to count the parentheses, I think grammar 2 still wins, right? Over
yeah, that. I wasn't interested in which grammar.
But I think the point here, I mean, evaluations can be done, but I think, the point, and this is, if you go back and look at Goodman's work initially, that Noam, I think, is channeling. I mean, the important point here, and remember, this is all part of the rejection of the appeal to meaning, was that you could just look at formal systems qua formal systems, okay, given that you have some way of constructing them, and then sort of say, look, there's ways of saying this one is better than that one, even though in some sense they're extensionally equivalent. So in this case, we do have extensional equivalence, but we have a way of saying one is better than the other because of these notational conventions. The conventions, which are represented by the parentheses, give us greater depth of generalization. And this idea, I think, was very powerful, that you could just look at the formal system itself and say it's better than that other formal system without anything more than that, just the structure of the system. So I think that's sort of, what I think was the real insight here. And, I mean, it was part of the move that, also was going on, and I think is a landmark paper on WH movement, to really push the number of rules down to a small, unique, finite set, ultimately to limit the class of rules to be small and finite. So your second question was about, sorry, was on slide
19.
19, your second comment. Oh, yes. Okay, fair enough. Look, I think that the way I think about things is that these I think of as abstract principles because they are stated purely over syntactic structures, over the formal configurations of syntactic structures. That's all they do. So there's nothing about anything else than that. It's not as if there's a bunch of empirical observations and, these are ones which are inductively determined over them, and they sort of capture an empirical generalizations like, I don't know, butterflies have wings is an empirical generalization. So I see them as much more abstract in that regard. There should
Right,
be
but
these
see,
relations.
the notion, but you see there you use the notion more abstract.
Did I? Okay. And
It seemed to me that on slide 19 you have you were trying to say that certain things are abstract and other things are not at all abstract, and I don't see.
Oh no, I wouldn't. Yeah, okay. That I think I did not intend. That I did not intend. But I think that what I at least saw in our work was this striving for trying to characterize linguistic laws, things that were lawful properties of language. And that was really what the goal was, and that these principles, none of us, I think, ever thought they were the be all and end all. But we did have a sense, at least I thought we had a sense that they had general characteristics that would qualify them as scientific law, or law in the scientific sense. And this was what captured our attention about them and why we would, entertain them and look for, again, deeper explanations, to try and see if they were really just a stopping off point and getting deeper insight within the broad conceptual apparatus we were working. So I think really that's the notion. And law, I think, when you look at it, it's sort of this abstract notion, abstract theoretical claims. And I think that we saw these principles as having that character, and hence that's what it gave us the really profound command it had on all of our attention. All of these principles did to research them deeply, which we did.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Anybody else? Floor is open to anybody. Junior, senior, middle people, anybody? Bob.
Yeah, nice talk, Robert. I had a couple of comments. One is that in the UCLA lectures, Chomsky suggests that virtually everything is syntax. That is, starting with generative phonology up through formal semantics. I think it's worth thinking about. I don't, I'm not asking for an answer. The other point I wanted to make was you say that the central goal of linguistic theory was to define the notion of language, and then you say it's the answer to the question, what is a language? And in so doing, we have two concepts of language. One is a language versus language in general. And in the first chapter of What Kind of Creatures Are We?, Chomsky points out that language has been studied for over 2,500 years, and we still don't have an answer to the question, what is language? Mm-hmm. The answer to the question, what is a language, seems to me to be basically a computational system in the mind of a speaker. And you could think of that, the computational system includes a lexicon and the generative mechanisms that create structured linguistic expressions. Mm-hmm. That seems to me to be fairly clear and straightforward. I think that the question of what is language is, as Chomsky pointed out, still unknown.
Right, but there's a difference between what's known and what a theory is attempting to be about and what we're inquiring. I mean, the question of physics, of cosmology is what is the cosmos? That's the question which they're trying to figure out and answer, but the answer is still very unknown. So there's a difference between what's the question which defines a field of inquiry and what the theories of that field can tell us about the phenomena it's about. So linguistics, as I take it, is trying to answer the question, what is that? Well, human language, that's the question it's trying to answer. And it's giving a theory. And then we can look at what that theory tells us about that. And what the theory is going to tell us in particular is going to give us, he's going to give us what Chomsky called the book. It's the logical structure of linguistic theory. It's the logical structure of a theory. Oh, there you are. Sorry, you just shifted on the screen. It's the logical structure of a theory that's giving us an answer, a particular kind of answer to a question. What is a language? What does it is to be a language? Okay, as part of the answer to the more broad, as part of the answer to the broad question, which linguistics is concerned with. So it gives a theory, and that theory has a particular form, and it's one which in many ways I think not in many ways, but we still are basically governed by. Now, the question I think you were sliding into, the issue you were sliding into, is a question which is, a great unknown question, is why is it that formal theories, as our linguistic theories are, why are they successful, and why are they, first of all, and why are they successful as theories of our cognitive lives? Why is it that they are also cognitive theories? Just to say, look, language is this cognitive structure, well, of course it is. That's not telling me any news. What the news is supposed to be is what the nature, and it's computational, no news there. What I'm trying to find out is why is it this theory is actually giving a theory that's emanating truths about my cognitive nature, about my mind. And that's, a deep question, and it's been broadly debated about why it is that we should think formal theories. And look, formal theories are just formal theories. And you don't look at logic, it's just what it is. But it's something different to say logic is a theory of human reasoning. That's a different thing to say that. And why is it a theory of human reasoning? What relation does it have to what we actually do? Those are interesting questions. So I think that the mapping question between formal theories and the nature of us as cognitive beings is a very profound question, and certainly a question Noam has said many, many, not always consistent things about. So I think that's an interesting question.
It's very good. Thank you. Howard?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for co-organizing this whole event. It's been a very nice initial lecture. Just a brief footnote about Robert's reply to Richie's first question about the symbol counting. On page, if you take a look at page 43 of Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. No.
Wait. If you're gonna do that on me, I'm gonna find my. Here we go.
No, I'm gonna agree. I'm about to agree with you.
Okay, I just want to see the text.
No, I'm on page 43 explicitly and without any discussion assumes exactly the same mode of symbol counting that Robert was assuming.
Yeah. This is my first edition. One day I walked into the office, those of you like these anecdotes, I walked into the office in building 20 of the linguistics department, and the MIT press had just found a bunch of these original copies and just threw them on the table. Just take them. And then there was when Howard bought a whole box of them for $0.05 a copy.
That's right. Exactly. I gave them to my students for years.
Anything else, Howard? Was that the comment? So did you have a question as well?
Nope, that was it. Just that brief footnote.
Oh boy, I
Okay.
don't know. Whenever I talk about LSLT, Howard always corrects me about something I said. So
Well,
I was a little worried.
well, given that you said that,
No,
I will say,
no.
I will say that in LSLT, in fact, on page, it was 1975, not 73, but on page 1 of the 1975 published version, there's a quite explicit reference to the learnability issue. He wasn't
Yes,
using the term explanatory adequacy yet, but
Yes,
the learnability issue was front and center.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. It was 1975, but the talk that the introduction was based on was from the class of, it was in 1973.
Right. Yeah.
By the way, for those of you still on, I highly, highly recommend a read of the introduction to the published version of LSLT. It's maybe the only place, or certainly one of the only places, where Chomsky undertakes an extended intellectual autobiography. And I found it just one of the most revealing and insightful and interesting papers on sort of the foundational notions of generative grammar and what Noam was thinking about, what he was influenced by at the time. In many ways, my single favorite piece of work by Chomsky. And I highly recommend it to everyone to read. It's a wonderful piece.
Great recommendation. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? Anybody's welcome. Maybe some junior people have gathered up some more questions.
Well, if I may butt in, so what you just said about the first chapter of LSLT is definitely correct. Same goes for the first chapter of aspects as well. So I hope that especially all the junior people here realize that even today, 50, 60, 70 years later, it's really worthwhile reading some of the original texts. And you did a great job reflecting on their development, as well as your own contribution from your dissertation and after. Could you perhaps, maybe benefit for the junior colleagues that we have here, or the students, perhaps get some ideas of where they might take off from now, for the future, some ideas of what you consider to be questions that are still relevant to be asked in future investigations of syntax, semantics, interfaces, mappings, and so on. Yeah.
Well, in a certain sense, my reaction to that is to not say anything. I think it's for younger people to do that. We had to. This is one of those things that we had to do it. So you got to do it. No, look. In a certain sense, seriously. I mean, the fields only have vitality as younger people give it that vitality with the ideas they have, the things that interest them. And we may be grumpy about some of it and think it's not going down the right way and try to guide when it happens. But the younger people inherit the field, and it's theirs to make and change as to questions that they think as important. I really would like, but to sort of say, if there's one area, I would really like to see people to go back and really start to go back into Anaphora as really integrating it back into syntactic theory and the syntactic conditions on Anaphora. I know Richie and Howard and Bob I think will all agree that that was an incredibly exciting time in linguistics, and that the whole interaction of Anaphora, movement, control, quantifier scope, covert movement, all that stuff was so interconnected, and it was really every paper seemed to have some new insight. With just coming out of all sorts of places, and people were like looking at new languages to try and see how it related to that set of issues. It wasn't just, let's look at language X. It was like, from Italian, there's all these really interesting things, or Richie's contributions about French, that were really showing great things about another language. These were really exciting times. And I think, Anaphora sort of has fallen by the wayside as a sort of central animating topic. And okay, research programs change, and that's fine. It's a different research program than it was at that time. But I do think that Anaphora would be something that'd be really worthwhile to people to go back and really start to explore that to look for it in a very, not just, you know, a distributional way, but in a really a principle, to really look deeply into the principles of Anaphora. Maybe we were just lucky. We came along at an exciting time to look at those things, but I think that's, I'd like to see people really, you know, would like to go back and work on that. But, you know, that's what I'm interested in. So, of course, I'd like to see more people work on it.
That's great. Anybody else, please? If not, I might jump in and ask a question because I've been waiting for my turn for a long time. You know how in minimalism, there's an idea that syntax theorizing should be motivated by sound and meaning, that we should be minimalistic about other elements and anything that's not motivated by sound and meaning. What do you think of that with respect to what you said about the interfaces and the minimal interaction between them? To me, it's like this idea seems like syntax is very strongly connected now to sound and meaning, and the features we use and linearization. All these ideas come almost looking at other components and make syntax appeal to those in those ways. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know if I have specific thoughts regarding minimalism outside of, you know, one should always be striving for the best set of theoretical principles over general guidelines of inquiry. But look, I think that if we're talking about sort of the last part of the talk, I do think that, you know, even though I'm looking at this loose interface, they're very permeable interfaces. So we certainly should be expecting, you know, issues about, well, linearization, sound, you know, those kinds of things coming into syntax. We should also expect certain things about meaning coming into syntax. We certainly should, but we're doing that in terms of, you know, what kinds of phenomena and evidence are we trying to account for with respect to syntactic theory? What evidence is it, you know, supposed to be? And there's nothing a priori about what's syntactic evidence and what the kinds of things that syntax is supposed to be. And I think this is sort of a little bit of what Bob was intimating, Frieden was intimating about a little earlier. So I think that, yeah, we should expect those kinds of effects. But I think we also have to understand what we're trying to characterize syntactically.
All right, great, thank you. Anybody else? We are coming on to 2 o'clock here, so I don't know if Robert is up to keeping going or
Sure. I mean, I can stay on if people like to keep chatting. I'm perfectly happy to do so.
Yeah. Okay, we can stay on for a little longer if there is interest and more questions. Alternatively, we can start wrapping up. It's up to you guys. You know, while you're thinking, I'll give you some time to think. We need to run a little administrative poll on the preference for the days of these talks. So I'm going to start a poll, and you would have to choose whether you prefer Saturdays for these talks or a weekday. So let's do that while you're still thinking if you have any more questions or comments for Robert. So I'm going to run the poll now.
Well, there's only half the people, half the people left.
I know, but we'll consider this a representative sample of
sure.
people. So
The hardcore group.
Exactly.
You still got the
yeah,
hardcore.
we're the people.
And of course, the rationale behind the Saturday is that many of us are busy during the week. Some of our institutions may have talks at different days of the week as well. Plus, you know, this way we can accommodate different time zones as well. Since, you know, I'm, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean, So Saturdays seems to work quite well for us from that perspective. And it's a day that we typically have for conferences anyway. But we appreciate if people feel differently and perhaps on a weekday instead.
Well, looks like they do not. Look at that. It's Saturday or
Ah,
no
that's fantastic.
preference. That's fantastic.
good.
It's good for us because we would be struggling if it was a weekday. All right, we'll keep it.
All right, well,
There is somebody
somebody
for weekday. Somebody chose a weekday, but a very small minority.
Everybody else is our friend.
Yes. So we shared the results. We'll keep it for Saturdays. If we might ask in the email to people who couldn't vote to send us a vote by email, and if we are bombarded by weekday people, we'll reassess. Let's see if there are any other questions before I start wrapping up. Any other comments or questions for Robert? Okay, it looks like we've covered all of it very nicely. So let us all thank Robert for a great presentation and very interesting discussion. So thank you so much. And
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Lydia and Clay, for the organization.
Thanks a lot. It was fantastic. A great foundational talk for reflections, I thought.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Just what we were looking for. Perfect. Let's see. Thanks everyone for joining us. And please remember that our next talk will be by Richard Kane on February 10th. Please save the date. Same time, noon Standard Eastern Time. And it's going to be titled, we have a title now, so you'll be one of the first people to hear the title. Generative syntax over the years, on some changes and on some non-changes. So very intriguing. We hope to see you all there. And of course, stay tuned for the Zoom link as usual. And we also want to mention the glowing lecture. Glow has a series of talks as well. And that's going to be on December 15th by Charles Rees, who was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here. And it's going to be on phonology. So that's going to be interesting as well. So please tune in for more information on that from Glow. And on this note, I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and see you later at our next talk. Bye, everybody.
Right. Great. And I just put in the glowing lectures link in there too in the chat, but now people are leaving.